Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee and today I want to talk about writing good scenarios. So what is it about a game that makes for a really good scenario? Is it problem solving, tactical compromises, or simply just lots of action? Do randomly generated layouts make games better because they're more unpredictable? Or does the imbalance of a historical scenario make a game better? No one opinion will agree, we'll all disagree I'm sure, but it will all depend on the type of game you're playing and perhaps also your background, but I'll come back to that a little bit later on. So for any of you that have watched my videos before, it shouldn't come as a great surprise when I say that I think a good scenario has to have a good story attached to it. I'll try and put a link in there over here somewhere about my video on adding narrative to games, and I'm going to cover some of the points I did in that video in today's video. So like any good movie, games need to have a strong storyline. They need to have unexpected plot twists and other things like that, elements like that make a game memorable. In a way, what you're trying to do is take a battle and look at it like a character and make sure that there's some character development between the beginning of the battle and the end of the battle. Now for me, one of those elements has to be very good objectives. Now the objectives themselves need to be clear, but they need to help drive the action of the game. And I'm not just talking about one side beating another side. There needs to be objectives that so it's not just capturing a bridge or capturing a hill or something like that. I'm looking for something that encourages more deeper strategic thinking, as well as the tactical thing of trying to beat your opponent across that games table. You know, it leaves a lot of the interpretation and the execution of that plan, that strategic objective, if you like, to the players, and can create some interesting and unusual solutions. Now, good scenarios for me put the player in the commander's boots. Generals have more than just that one battle on their mind. They're invariably thinking about the wider objectives and challenges. They're looking at longer term aims, strategy, as well as winning that particular battle. And sometimes that's an element that gets left out of standalone games and scenarios. So I think it's an important thing to try and encourage with the use of really good objectives, perhaps story-driven objectives within a battle. Now, I'm sure I've mentioned this before in some of my other videos. I do think that imbalance in a game is actually quite interesting. Historical encounters are often more complex and more subtle than randomly generated games where you've got no control over the setting or what's happening. Real events are nearly always more complex, more granular, and therefore more interesting because they're more realistic. They're rarely balanced. You know, no commander's going to go into a fight unless he thinks he controls the whip hand. So it's very rare that you get a battle where things are completely balanced. And you know, and this is where point systems sort of, unfortunately, lead us down a point where we're constantly trying to do balance. But actually, sometimes you give a player an impossible objective, it makes for a much more interesting game. And providing everyone goes into it not desperate for a win, but desperate for a good game, then even losing under those circumstances can make for a really good scenario. Definitely imbalance in a game generates more interesting problems for players to overcome. Of course, it depends on the players themselves. You know, can they work the problem? You know, you have to keep your players in mind when you're writing these weird and quirky scenarios. You know, you don't want a game to be completely one-sided or not be fun. So it's important that you do know your players and what their skills and strengths are, and tailor to those strengths and weaknesses. And non-points based objectives or multiple objectives, leaving it to the player to decide what is important, can make for much more interesting games, both for the players and for the umpire. So I wanted to give a few practical tips, examples that I've come across in games before. And as I've already mentioned, aim less for balance and more for realism and playability. I think that's quite an important one. Give each side's completely different objectives. They don't all have to fight for the same hill. They can have different objectives that are mutually exclusive. Encourage separate mission objectives that increase the complexity while also trying to stop the enemy. It can create a totally new dynamic on a battlefield. introduced the fog of war because confusion is fun. I've played plenty of games where neither side has had a clue what's going on because of fog of war. Played a particularly really good online game with a friend, played by email. I've mentioned this before. Group of us playing, we could hardly see what was going on, we couldn't figure out where the enemy was, and you know what, it made for a fantastic game. It had us thinking in a whole different way and made for a really interesting thing. So definitely introduced the fog of war. Ambiguity, garbled intelligence, blind movement, they're brilliant tools for introducing that fog of war and helping people enjoy the game more, because it just challenges us in a different way. And of course campaigns as well encourage us to think more strategically as well as tactically. You know, is it time to pull out of this fight because you want to preserve your forces for another time? So definitely go down the route of campaigns if you can. But also something that I like to nick from role-playing games, obviously where I started, are things like random encounters. You know, such hand of fate type interventions keep a game exciting. But as an umpire, what I would say is it's worth being prepared to fudge the occasional roll so that your intervention is fair. It should be entertaining rather than a game decider. It needs to I think random events in a war game need to create the perception of danger, but in a controlled way. So now we get to the radical part of my discussion today. I'm going to make a suggestion, a very radical suggestion for some of you, and it may be a step too far. I think that umpires should not just be rules arbiters, but they should also be master performers. I like to think of an umpire's job as not just being, as I say, the rules arbiter, but as the conductor of a symphony. The umpire is the narrator of the game. So you need to not only tell people what they've got to roll and tell them what the end result is, but then describe the event that's happened, describe the actions, highlight those crisis points that make like a storyteller would, like a role player would, where a role-playing umpire would when running a game. It's more than just relaying rules and stats. As I say, it's telling the story. It's making sure that everyone is aware of the story and creating memories for future things. When you're looking back on a game, you're not just going to remember those appalling dice rolls, but you're going to remember that officer that was unseated from his horse by a lucky shot and so on. So you tell the story, makes for much more interesting games, I think. And it introduces flexibility for the umpire to guide the story, if not the outcome of the battle. So as usual, I'm going to throw the question out to you. What have you used to make scenarios more interesting? And once in motion, how do you keep a game interesting? And if you do have an umpire, because not everyone does use umpires, do you see a role for them as the conductor or the narrator of a story? You know, do you agree with me, or do you think I'm just bonkers? I'm quite happy to hear either opinion. And I'd love to hear from you, as always, in the comments below or over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and of course if you did, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with my weekly videos, please hit the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, get in as many games as you can, and of course, keep rolling high.